I'm sure you've heard it plenty of times. People complaining about how their teammates are bad, how certain characters are low skill, and seeing people discuss bad players with sub 50% win rates. But how exactly do we know when players are low skill? How can we measure it? What exactly are people referring to when they say someone is low skill? Some people may say win rate, some people may say character selection, some people may say attitude in the actual match, but it seems like even without having this definition, many people know what they consider to be a bad player. In other words, we don't have an agreement on how to measure skill, but we do have an agreement on what an unskilled player is. Hey everyone, my name is Husky, and you're used to seeing me with the cat ear headphones, but Let's be real. I'm trying to take things seriously. I'm mature, I'm a college professor. I should probably start acting like it. Let's first talk about quantitative metrics the game provides that lend themselves to the broad concept of skill measurement. And for those of you who don't know, quantitative basically just means numerical, measurable, something that can be quantified. These quantitative variables can be divided into two overarching subcategories, inside of a game and outside of a game. Inside of a game, we have number of KOs, assists, amount of damage dealt, taken, amount of healing, score, MVP rating, and level. And outside of a match, we have win rate overall, win rate per season, and individual character win rates. So let's start from our in-match variables and kind of dive into those a little more and how they may contribute to understanding skill. Let's focus on the first stats that we see at the end of the game. So score, I feel like, is a metric with the least amount of merit in terms of measuring skill. Usually we don't even look at this number, though the score at the end of the match is what determines who wins and loses. Scoring more or less during the match is not really considered as skill dependent because the amount of score usually depends more on Rayquaza or even the specific Pokemon that are chosen rather than any amount of skill expression. We'll talk more about this in the qualitative metrics section, but in terms of quantitative numerical score, I would say this is at the bottom of the list. Similarly, nobody cares about the MVP rating. It's cool to earn an MVP badge in a game, but it takes into account a few different metrics and comes up with a number between 1 and 100, and it's really not that important. Especially since we've already said that score isn't super important, and it heavily skews the MVP rating. This rating overall is not really a good metric for understanding skill. I feel like in some ways this is an indication of lower skill, if anything, because somehow it's always the player who's the worst in the team that ends up with the MVP. When you end a game, you can see the level that you ended at. Obviously, we know that the highest level one can achieve at the end of a game is 15, so seeing a Pokemon at that level at the end of the game is a pretty decent tell of how they played during the match and prioritize getting experience. On the other end, if you see a carry at level 11 at the end of the game, it probably means they didn't have too good of a game. So not the best measure of how skilled a player was on their own, but taken with other metrics, it can mean that a player had their priorities straight. Next up, let's talk about assists. So seeing the amount of assists being high is a good indicator of playing with the team, which is a pretty good indication of, at the very least, an understanding of teamwork. You'd expect a certain Pokemon to have more assists and less KOs, like support and defender players, because these are supposed to be the characters assisting the team, if you will. Now, assists wouldn't be the only thing I'd use to call someone a skilled player, but it definitely means something. A lot of assists in combination with some other quantitative metrics would be a good addition to a claim of skill, but on its own, it's much less likely to be a great indication. I'll talk more about that as I talk about our next few metrics. Here's where things start to get interesting. I feel like the number of KOs is the first thing players will look at the end of a match screen. Getting a lot of KOs often means you played a great game, and not getting a lot of KOs means you may not have played a great game. But it's not that simple, because it never is. If you had a Talonflame with 0 KOs, alright, they probably didn't do super well. If you had a Clefable with 0 KOs, that's probably fine depending on some other metrics. So again, though skill is a little more obvious when someone in a match gets a ton of KOs, not getting a lot of KOs doesn't necessarily indicate a bad player depending on the role in some of the other metrics I've talked about and will continue to talk about. Generally, we've all had a situation where we drop 15 KOs, lose, and get to the end screen to see that our Cinderace had 1 KO, even if they were level 15, had 12 assists, and scored 150 points. I feel like many of our first instincts would be like, what was the Cinderace doing? Why didn't they get any KOs? Even if they technically played okay during the match. I feel like many players will jump to attribute skill to this number as their first instinct in their personal evaluation. Alright, now let's get to the numbers we see on our next screen, starting with damage dealt. Like KOs, this is the number I feel like many people focus on as indicating a really good or a really bad match. For me personally, as well, this number means more to me than KOs. If I do 120k damage, even if the enemy team composition was tanky and it made sense that I did a lot of damage, I feel like I had a really good game. Same with other players. If I see big damage numbers, I assume that player did pretty well. Sometimes it's not super hard to do a lot of damage depending on the team composition, but I think out of anything, a lot of damage is the thing players may jump to as a skill indication. Similarly, a low amount of damage, specifically on a carry Pokemon, is often viewed as an indicator of lack of skill. However, it's important to note that this skill indicator applies mainly to carries. Having 30k damage as Umbreon is much more acceptable than a 30k Greninja. Instead of damage dealt numbers indicating higher skill on defenders and supports, a better indication is often damage taken or healed. So taking damage is the definition of what a frontline is supposed to do. So if your defender takes the most damage in the game, it reads the same as high damage dealt. You probably had a pretty good game. Same with healing. If your job is to heal and you heal a lot, it's a better indicator of high skill than numbers like KOs and damage dealt. Let's break down all of these points I just made into a few overarching statements. If you're playing a carry Pokemon, more specifically an attacker, speedster, or all-rounder, having these impactful high numbers in these metrics is your job. A carry is expected to have high damage, high numbers of KOs, be at a high level. Does it mean that you're a skilled overall player if you had 100k damage and 25 KOs in one game? Not necessarily. It just means you had a good game. Similarly, does it mean you're an unskilled player if you had 25k damage and 1 KO? Not necessarily. It just means you had a bad game. Now that being said, if you're a carry and you consistently put up a ton of KOs and damage, I would personally say that's more indicative of higher skill and vice versa. Now, if you're playing a defender or support Pokemon, taking or healing a lot of damage is your job. All these things I said about carries basically apply to supports and defenders, with these other metrics just being the ones that are the most important. Alright, now is the discussion that we've all been waiting for. The infamous win rate discussion. Since the dawn of time, people have been talking about win rate. Some say win rate means nothing, some use win rate as proof of high or low skill, so it's time we talk about it. Buckle in, because I might piss some people off. Firstly, win rate means something. Win rate means a lot of something, but it's not everything. Having a high win rate doesn't mean you won't suck in some games. Having a low win rate doesn't mean you won't have insanely good games, but generally, you don't often see someone who's regarded as a good player with a low win rate. There's a reason Chris Heroes with only solo queue play has over a 60% win rate. There's a reason you'll never find a regarded pro player with a sub 55% win rate. Let's get a little deeper into this. Let's talk about solo queue. One of the arguments I hear against win rate mattering is that some people only play solo, and solo is generally much more difficult to win games because it requires a lot more luck. I'm going to draw on something I've heard before. A normal player will be handed, let's say, 45% losses, 45% wins, leaving only 10% of games that are actually controllable by the player. Good players will win those 10%, bad players will lose those 10%. If you're the player losing those 10% and still blaming your teammates, it's likely you're making more mistakes than you think you are. Now, of course, it's not that simple. We're talking about solo queue, remember. Some people play strictly supports, some even in solo queue, or roles that depend completely on their team's decisions to win the game. It doesn't mean the support can't have some control over their wins and losses, but it does mean it's a little more difficult to have that control. Carry roles, however, have much more control over what happens in their games, much more control over that 10%. This is different for people playing duo, trio, or 5-stack games because they have more control over the outcome of the game because much of the team's composition is made up by players who are working together. So if you're playing support or defender in those compositions, it's not the same. Generally, yes. Sometimes your win rate will be affected by players who are less skilled than you. Ask anyone. Good players, streamers, they'll all talk about games that are just impossible to win due to bad teammates. But it's not every game. Like I said, it statistically works out to about 45% guaranteed wins and 45% guaranteed losses. That extra 10% is what shows what you can do. If you're losing 7% of that 10% and still blaming your team for it, I'd say it's much less likely that you're a high skill player. Now, a really good player can take that 10% of games with control and turn it into more like 20%, where they can actually turn around predetermined losses and win them. In that case, yeah, I'd say win rate matters a lot. Let's talk more specific. Players may get better over time, so it's important to also consider a player's season win rates, but more toward the end of the season, because when those 45% start to even out later on. If a player has an overall 49% win rate, but this season their win rate is 55%, they're doing much better. They're winning those 10% now when they weren't before. That says a lot. Now, if they have an overall 53% win rate and their season rate is 45%, there's something going on there. They've lost the ability to control that 10%. Could be because they are only playing Comfey now or something like that, but generally, my point stays the same. Even more specifically, we can look at individual Pokemon win rates and individual Pokemon season win rates. I played with someone who has over 1,100 Comfey games with a 39% win rate. Even as Comfey, that's not good. But they had other Pokemon where they had above a 50% win rate on, so it really just means that they play some Pokemon better than they play others. But again, season win rates are important. Some of us sucked when the game first came out, and we played a lot of games on Pikachu, and we weren't very good at it. Now Pikachu is still one of our top played mons, but we don't play it much anymore. So again, looking at the season win rates for Pokemon can also help give context for what the player's skill level is at currently. Overall, win rate is a tough discussion, but I really think it comes down to what you do with that 10% of games that you have control over. But win rate alone is not indicative of skill. You also need more information, like how they're playing in an actual game, who they're playing with, which characters they're selecting, things like that, which is why we need to explore qualitative metrics of skill measurement as well. Now let's talk about those qualitative metrics. If you're unfamiliar, qualitative is the opposite of quantitative. It doesn't specifically focus on numbers, but rather observations of the experience. So for these metrics, we will once again dive into the two overarching subcategories, inside and outside of a match. This time let's start with our outside of a match category, which includes character selection and item selection. And then inside of the match is quite difficult to categorize because it'll be a long one, but let's just focus on the following: micro, macro, and game presence. First, outside match. Choosing the right character or a good character is a really complicated facet of the game that takes a lot into consideration. I've talked about this a lot in some of my other videos, but it's more complicated than you think. For one thing, I feel it indicates higher levels of skill if you understand characters that counter other characters, feel for the team, or pick something up that really rounds out your team comp, things like that. However, there's a caveat to this. Sometimes players know their limits and they know what they're proficient with. Or they know their team is not proficient in certain things, so they pick something that's worse for the team comp. So it can be hard to tell with character selection which behaviors are indicative of high skill or low skill, and it's hard to quantify what plays 100% of the time are good or not good. However, I feel there's one universal truth. In draft, first picking a Pokemon that's not needed is not a very good play. There's literally never a time when you need to first pick Cinderace, truly. The other side of character selection that's important to consider is the character itself and the amount of skill that character takes. Now again, being a qualitative measure, there isn't a definitive way to determine which characters are more skill-based than others. But many players have arbitrarily figured out, in general, which characters take more skill and which characters don't take much skill. I'm not getting into micro skill stuff just yet. I'm focusing specifically on the character a player chooses, not necessarily how good that player is on that character. Because honestly, even if Mewtwo Y takes minimal skill, some players will still be better at playing it than others. The rules of thumb I've heard float around is that characters with point-and-click moves, or moves that don't take aiming or targeting to hit, are indicative of lower skill levels. Things like Stored Power on Espeon, Fire Spin on Delphox, Volt Tackle Pikachu, some auto-attacking Pokemon like Cinderace, things like that. Many speedsters, on the other hand, are considered to have higher skill because they have to balance their move cooldowns and press more buttons. Dodrio is a great example of this. It requires you to play differently because the direction you're facing matters when you use moves, so you have to have good micro skill to play it well. But honestly, I don't think this matters too much. I mean, I personally get a bit of an ego from saying that I play only Double Team Meowscarada instead of Trailblaze because it's considered a higher skill build, but some people just might enjoy the other playstyle more. I like Mystical Fire Sylveon more than Hyper Voice, but I like Dragon Dance Dragapult. I think to make this count for determining a player's skill level, you'd have to go back to our win rate discussion and take the most played Pokemon and the player's win rates on it. Like if someone's played 400 games on Mewtwo Y with a 56% win rate and 400 games on Snipeshot and Teleon with a 46% win rate, maybe that means more of something than just seeing a character selection in any given game. Item selection is quite similar. There are some items that are not really usable, and a lot of times we assume that bad item build means low skill. I mean, people could just be trolling or playing bad items on purpose, but playing special attack items on attackers or items that are generally unusable on Pokemon are just not great plays. To the general player base, we assume these players just have low understanding of the game overall. Any item build can technically win a game, but I feel like when you see a suboptimal build, we do still assume it's being played by someone who has no idea what they're doing. That being said, that's not always the case. Sometimes good players try out bad builds. We can assume a bad build means minimal gameplay understanding, but we can't definitively say it. Again, there are some things that taken together say more things than taken on their own. A poor character selection process and bad items say more about skill than bad items or bad character selection on their own. Another qualitative metric is the game presence of a player. It includes their attitude, their investment in the game, their communication with teammates, tilts, things like that. Going AFK after dying once is really annoying, and I feel like many people consider that decision indicates a player that is not very good. Same with a chronic thanks or check it out pinger. Many of us will associate lower skill with players who make these decisions or generally have bad attitudes about playing the game. But of course, that isn't necessarily the case. It's hard to say for sure if these players are good players, because sometimes players just get tilted and start playing worse than they normally do. But I think overall, if we're taking game presence as an overarching metric, I would say that poor game presence is more likely to be indicative of poor skill as opposed to good game presence. But again, it's fully qualitative, so it's hard to measure. Micro skill is the skill one possesses on their character of choice, basically their button pressing skill. It's honestly hard to tell micro skill inside of a game unless there are specific combos that someone clearly doesn't know how to use, and honestly to me it means the player is not very skilled on that Pokemon. For example, if a Garchomp is not using Dragon Rush into Dragon Claw to pick up and isolate an enemy, they do not have a high level of micro skill. If the Gengar is throwing Dream Eater and then basic attacking to close the distance, they do not have good micro. I could go on. But generally, good micro is easier to tell than suboptimal micro, especially when it's on the enemy team. That Zoroark who just keeps running over the team with feint attack combos over and over again has good micro, and it's not hard to see that. The Mimikyu balancing their play rough cooldown and hitting high skill shadow sneak shots has pretty good micro. But as with everything we've talked about, having high skill on pressing buttons isn't everything. It probably means the player is pretty good on that Pokemon, but taken by itself, it doesn't mean they're an overall good player. Finally, let's talk about macro skill, or the skill of game understanding, seeing the game as a whole rather than just as your character. This is the harder skill to master, so if a player has really good macro, I personally think this is the best indicator on its own of a good player. That opinion is just my own opinion. There's nothing I have backing that to prove it, but if you're asking me how I would measure skill using one metric, I'd say macro gameplay. But what does this mean? Bad macro is the easiest thing to spot in a game. It's all of the bad positioning plays, it's all the not showing up to Ray, farming away from the team, breaking goals with low overcaps, walking directly into the enemy team. It's all those bad plays we talk about all the time. It's a hard thing to keep track of where everyone is, what the game state is, what's happening on the field, so if a good player can control that, they would have a higher level of macro skill. It's also understanding what other Pokemon do. Even if you don't play every Pokemon, knowing that a Blaziken is likely to use Overheat from a bush and deciding not to face check is indicative of good macro. I honestly feel like what leads people even checking a player's win rate is bad macro. At the end of the game, your thanks pinging Duraludon decided to rip right into all 5 of the enemies and then lost it for your team, so you go check their profile, turns out they have a 47% win rate. That's, I feel like, one of the most common lines of thinking. I would go as far as to say that a combination of good macro and win rate is the best overall way to measure skill. But again, macro is a qualitative thing, so getting that measurement would require an agreement on what gameplay indicates good and bad macro, and what numerical value to assign to it before that statement can be proven. My community also seems to believe macro is the best skill measurement. See? 55% of these 203 voters, as of when I took this screenshot, agreed that macro is the best way to measure skill, followed by attitude or game presence, which is another qualitative measure. Though this is a very small sample size, I would go as far as to say that qualitative measurements are how most players judge the skill of other players, and that quantitative is just used as a way to explain those qualitative observations. So in reality, all of us are using mixed methods to answer our own questions and create theories, which is cool, at least to me. Let's talk about some opinions shared on this post. One comment says, I feel like win rate doesn't really determine a player's skill. I've seen so many bad players with high win rates, which means they probably grind a lot of quick battles. I have like a 51% win rate. No, I'm not a bad player, I just get trolled a lot in my games. I think macro and overall map awareness determines players' skill. If they know the timers like the bees and the spawn into the map, I know when it's a good time to engage in fights, farm when you're under-leveled, and always have a unite during Ray, you can tell they're a skilled player, or at least knows how to play the game at a skilled level. A couple things here stand out to me. The first is that they think macro and map awareness is the best skill determination, following along with the narrative I presented above. The second thing is that this player claims win rate doesn't determine skill because of their personal experience. Seeing bad players with high win rates and they themselves believing they are a good player even though they have a low win rate. Another comment says, macro is the biggest thing, win rate depends on a lot of factors like the game deciding you will have the worst team every game for whatever reason. Similarly, this player says macro is important. Also similarly, they bring up how win rate isn't the greatest determination because of being paired with bad players. Both of these comments stood out to me because it's likely they're drawing on their own experience to make the conclusion that many people want to quantitatively assign win rate as being equated to skill. But what about when there are games you can't win? It must be something else. Now, I have plenty to say about people assuming their teammates are always the problem, not specifically saying that these two players are doing that, and some of it I said in this video, but you should check out my other video on the player base as well. So yeah, all these metrics together is probably the best way to get an accurate determination of skill level. But going with my opinion and the community opinion, let's say macro is how we can measure skill. Again, this is fully qualitative. However, the bad macro players are much more quantifiable than good macro players. If I ask the player base give me some bad macro plays, I get things like backcapping at Ray, ripping Ray when you're already winning, running into enemies alone, not going back to jungle after the first rotation, things like that. Now these are very easy plays to spot because it stands out immediately since these things are going wrong. You can see your teammate heading for a backcap, and you can see the immediate poor repercussions that decision causes. This is part of a phenomenon called the negativity bias. There's a ton of literature on this, you can literally look this up and get plenty of results, but basically it states that it's a human experience to notice and remember negative experiences more strongly than positive experiences. It's easier for us to see the backcap and remember that this was a bad play than it is for us to see our teammates secure a penta and remember this is a good play. So if I ask players to give me some examples of good macro plays, they'll likely speak from a more personal perspective, remembering either quantifiable things that they do or remembering bad things someone else did and imagining if that play was good. For example, show up to Ray, have your unite move at Ray, fight with the team, frontline for your carries. The first two examples are very specific and quantifiable, but the second two examples are much more nuanced. We know when it's worth it sometimes not to fight with the team. For example, if your team is running into a fight they can't win. And in terms of frontlining for your carries, we know in a solo queue environment that sometimes your carries are the one out of position, and frontlining for them would be a bad decision. So it's more difficult to name quantifiable good plays than quantifiable bad plays, which again, I attribute to the negativity bias. I mean, how often do we remember a good player unless they're a popular community figure, yourself, or your buddies you frequently play with? Alright, maybe you're a really nice guy, and you love to GG your teammates, and you point out how every play that was good that other players did. So maybe I'm wrong with that inference. But I bet you remember a bad player to a much greater degree. How often are the good players you remember linked to a bad player? For example, do you remember your good teammate because they were able to stay alive and steal Ray after your bad teammate got everyone KO'd? This is probably not true for everyone, and I know that, but it may be true for many of us under the assumption of negativity bias. Let me bring it back. I can't measure skill definitively. The most we have is vague statements and vague understandings of who specifically is good and bad at this game. We all think we're pretty good. or at least decent at the game, and we use that as a basis for our judgments. It seems like macro plays are the best thing we have to determine skill, but in reality, it's every single thing a player does that goes into their overall skill level. Overall, everything I mentioned means something on its own, but it means much more when combined with other metrics. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know your thoughts. I'd love to talk to you about it. And if you like this type of content, I have a playlist with videos similar to this, and I'd love if you check those out too. That's all, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!